Hello there. Welcome back to the channel. That is Steph is so weird. Nice, Steph. Hi. We are here to read The Curse of the Blue Figurine, continuation. Today's chapter 8. It's by John Bellairs. And I'm just going to dive right into it because it is a busy day. I have a lot going on. And I did not do this yesterday or the day before. So, hi, chapter 8. It was a bright, sunshiny Saturday in May, and the professor was up on the square Italian cupola that jutted above the roof of his house. He was wearing overalls, his mouth was full of nails, and he had a hammer in his hand. The cupola had windows all around a tiled roof with a silly wooden finial sprouting from it. All around the cupola, rickety scaffolding had been built, and attached to the cupola roof was a fantastic framework of wooden slats, braces, joists, and whatnot. Someday, when it was finished, this framework would support an elaborate radio aerial. The professor was a wild Red Sox fan. He loved to listen to the Sox on the radio while he corrected his students' papers. The problem was the problem with this was WITS, WITS, in Boston was the only station that carried the baseball games, and its signal was pretty faint by the time it reached Dustin Heights. But the professor was confident that his super duper whiz bang aerial would solve the problem. He had been reading up on aerials in Mechanics Illustrated and other handyman magazines. And his study was a blueprint that he had drawn up all by himself. Now he could only get the job. Now, if only he could get the job done, everything would be fine. But as he worked, the professor frowned and muttered to himself. He was worried. Not about his work, but about Johnny. It was May 10th, 10 days after Johnny's run in with Eddie Tompke. And in all that time, the professor had not seen Johnny to talk with, not once. Normally, Johnny came over 3 or 4 times a week for chess and conversation, and of course, chocolate cake. But not now. At first, the professor had felt hurt. Then he had told himself that he was an old fool, that Johnny had no doubt found some young friend who was fun to be with. But then he began to watch for Johnny out of the front windows of his house, and what he saw alarmed him. Johnny was never with anyone. He always walked alone, head down, briefcase in hand, and he looked awful. His face was very pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked as if he had not slept for a week. And so the professor was concerned. He wanted to know what was wrong. So far, he had resisted the urge to butt in on the Dixons' family affairs. He couldn't imagine that Grandma and Grandpa were mistreating Johnny. That did not seem possible. But then, what was going on? The professor drove in another nail. The framework creaked and shuddered, and the professor growled at it. He ordered he ordered it to hold together. From somewhere below, a door slammed. The professor glanced over and saw Johnny blotted down the front steps of his house. Now he was moving along the sidewalk, head down, head forward, hands folded behind his back. Oh, this is unbearable, grumbled the professor to himself. I have to go see the Dixons, or I will go out of my ever loving mind. And slowly he began to clamber down the scaffolding. A few minutes later, the professor was knocking at the front door of the Dixon house. Presently, the door rattled open. There stood Grandpa. He was wearing a blue denim apron, and his sleeves were rolled up. In one hand, he held a hypodermic syringe. The professor was not surprised at this. He knew that Grandpa Dixon had diabetes and that Grandma Dixon had diabetes, and Grandpa had to give her an insulin shot once every day. Normally, in this kind of situation, the professor would have made some sort of wisecrack. He would have called Grandpa young Mr. Malone or some such thing. But he was not in a wisecracking mood. And he could see from Grandpa's long face that he was not feeling very jokey either. Hi, Henry, said the professor, smiling faintly. All right if I come in? Sure. come on out to the kitchen. It's shot time, as you can see. It'll be over in a minute." The professor followed Grandpa out to the kitchen. There he found Grandma sitting at the white and amber table. The sleeve of her dress was rolled up, and on the table was a bottle of rubbing alcohol. Nearby lay some wads of cotton. Uh, uh, sorry. The sleeve of her dress was rolled up, and on the table was a bottle of rubbing alcohol. Nearby lay some wads of cotton. The professor sat down, and he politely turned away his face as Grandpa shoved the needle into Grandma's arm. Then, when it was over and Grandma was rinsing the hypodermic in the sink, the professor cleared his throat humphrily, harumphily, harumphily. I just like the word. Okay. "I came over to talk to you two about Johnny," he began. I've been a bit worried about him." "So are we," said Grandma, frowning. "He didn't sleep good at night, and he has bad dreams. Woke up screaming and yelling to beat the band the other night. Scared the dickens out of me, but he wouldn't tell us what the heck was wrong. You don't eat good either," added Grandpa as he dried the glass hypodermic tube with a linen towel. "Just picks at his food like a little bird. I asked him the other day if something was wrong, but he said no. Everything was fine. Can you beat that? I don't know what to make of it. Do you know what's eating him, Rod? I mean, you're his friend and all, so I thought maybe, well, you thought wrong," said the professor gloomily. "I haven't seen him to talk to in about 2 weeks. I came here hoping that you two might enlighten me." The professor gazed discontently around the room. He looked at the hexagonal hexagonal he looked at the hexagonal red electric clock that hung over the stove at the rack um, at the rack of test tubes that stood on the windowsill. "I saw him going somewhere the other night. Do you know where he goes?" Grandpa shrugged. "As far as I know, he goes down to the church. He says he wants to light a candle for his mom and pray. I don't see anything wrong with that, do you?" The professor shook his head. "No, but if that's what he's really doing, not if that's what he's really doing. But with your permission, I think I'm going to follow him one of these nights to see where he goes. I'm good at tailing people. I was an intelligence officer training." Hang on. "I'm good at tailing people. I was an intelligence officer during World War One. My code name was the Crab." Grandma laughed loudly, and the professor glared at her. "What's so funny about that?" he snapped. "I don't see anything to laugh at. Do you, Henry?" Grandpa bit his lip and shook his head solemnly. And then, to cover up the giggling fit that had come over him, he rushed over to the stove and poured the professor a nice hot cup of coffee. Grandma, Grandpa, and the professor talked for a little while longer, and they cooked up a scheme. Grandpa would call up the professor the next time he knew that Johnny was going to one of his nighttime visits to the church. Then the professor would shadow Johnny, and, well, they all three hoped that this would help them get to the bottom of the mystery. They cared for Johnny a lot, and they did not want anything bad to happen to him. As it turned out, the three conspirators got a chance to put their plan into action sooner than they might have expected. That evening at dinner, Johnny announced that he was going down to the church to pray. When? Oh, around 8 o'clock. Grandma looked at Grandpa, and Grandpa stared at the salt cellar. Both of them tried hard to act unconcerned. Grandma smiled weakly and said in a falsely cheerful voice, "Well, that's fine. I sure think it's good when a boy your age goes to church without being dragged there by the heels." Then she looked hard at Johnny and asked in a more serious tone, "Johnny?" Johnny laid down his fork and stared back at Grandma. He felt defensive. His guard was up. What did she want to know? "Yeah, Grandma, what is it?" The tone of Johnny's voice was so unfriendly that Grandma was startled. Hmm. "Yeah, Grandma, what is it?" The tone of Johnny's voice was so unfriendly that Grandma was startled. She glanced quickly down and began to toy with a piece of celery on her plate. Well, your grandpa and me were wondering if you felt okay these days. I mean, if there's anything on your mind, we could, well, kind of help you with it." Johnny's eyes were stony. "I don't know what you're talking about, Grandma. I'm all right. I just want to go down to the church to pray tonight. That's all. Is that okay with you?" Grandma nodded helplessly, and that was the end of the conversation. The meal went on in silence. After dessert, Johnny went upstairs to his room, closed the door, and bolted it. He sat down on his bed and stared around at the old fashioned furniture. The tall, gloomy clothes press with the scrolled decorations on the front, the marble top bureau with the mirror, the bristly brown armchair, the old pictures in heavy black frames, and the Motorola radio on the uh, scarred black end table by the window. And then the hard, tense look on Johnny's face melted. He burst into tears. Ever since the 1st of May, Johnny had been living inside a nightmare. He was hearing and seeing strange things, and he was doing things without knowing why he did them. He felt that he was in danger, terrible danger, but he was scared to death to tell anybody about it. First, there was the figurine. It was magic, it was enchanted. He knew that by now. Every morning, as regular as clockwork, Johnny would get out of bed, take the figurine from its hiding place, stroke it, and say the prayer to Thoth and Taurus. He had to. He wasn't sure why he did this, but he knew he had to. And at night, sometimes, as he was laying in bed trying to sleep, Johnny would hear whispering coming from the closet where the figurine was hidden. Sometimes he almost thought he could figure out what the whispering voice was saying. And there was the ring. It was magic too. It was connected with the figurine in some way that Johnny didn't understand. He wanted to take the ring off, but he was scared to. It hurt his finger sometimes, made the bone of his finger ache and throb, so that he wanted to cry out with pain. But something in his mind, an insistent voice, told him that he couldn't take the ring off, not even for a minute. If he did, awful things would happen to him. And then there were the dreams. Over and over every night, Johnny had the dream about R. Bart's antique shop. Over and over, the old lady in the green eye shade chased him through endless rooms, up endless cobweb staircases, or dragged him down to the dark, earth smelling, wormy graves. And he would wake up many times during the night, and he would look around wildly, convinced that there was somebody in his room. But when he turned on the lights, there was never anyone there. Johnny blew his nose and wiped his eyes. He smiled wanly. One good thing had been accomplished. Eddie Tompke was scared to death to him. Mm. Eddie Tompke was scared to death of him. After that afternoon down by the factories, Eddie had avoided Johnny like the plague. Whenever he passed Eddie on the stairs or in the lunchroom or wherever, Eddie would give him this goggly eyed, frightened stare and hurry past. Johnny had always daydreamed about having power, the power to scare off bullies. But now that he had the power, he didn't want it. Not if it was going to make him feel like this. Johnny was miserable, utterly miserable. He wanted to tell Grandma and Grandpa that he was frightened. But something, the ring or some other awful and evil force, forced him to keep his mouth shut. Johnny felt like somebody inside a glass walled, soundproof prison. He pounded on the walls, but nobody heard. He screamed, but no voice, no sound came out. Nervously, Johnny glanced at the Big Ben alarm clock that ticked loudly on his bureau. It was 8:15. He better get a move on. He didn't want to stay out too late. And where was he going? He was going to St. Michael's Church to see if he could find Mr. Beard, the little man who had given him the ring. Mr. Beard had said that he would see Johnny in about a week's time, but had he meant a week exactly or what? Johnny didn't know, but he did know one thing. He desperately needed to talk to the man. Night after night, he had gone down to the church hoping that Mr. Beard would show up, but he was never there. Did Mr. Beard know that the ring was magic? That was another large question in Johnny's mind. If he did know, that meant that he was evil. that he had conned Johnny into taking the ring. For his own peace of mind, Johnny wanted to think that Mr. Beard was a nice guy, that he hadn't known anything about the awful powers that lay hidden in the ring. Somewhere, Johnny had read a story about a magic bullet. Nope. Somewhere, Johnny had read a story about a magic amulet that hadn't seemed magic until somebody said a secret prayer over it. Maybe this was what happened. Maybe the ring had passed down through Mr. Beard's family for generations, and nobody had known that it was enchanted. And then Johnny had aroused the sleeping magic with his prayer to Thoth and prayer to Thoth and Eris, Taurus. I'm fine. Oh my god. And then Johnny had aroused the sleeping magic with his prayer to Thoth and Taurus. And what about the figurine? That was another deep, dark, frightening mystery that Johnny couldn't fathom. But he felt that he could deal with the blue figurine if he could get the ring off his finger. He was hoping frantically, that Mr. Beard would turn out to be an okay guy and that he would be willing to help. If he knew something about the ring, something that would allow Johnny to get rid of it, then later he would take a hammer and smash the smiling blue idol into a million tiny blue pieces. Yep. Johnny got up and glanced nervously around the room. He stared at the closet door, and for a second he had the horrible, unreasoning fear that the door would open and the blue figurine would come waddling out like a wind-up toy soldier. Johnny shuddered and left the room, turning out the light as he went. Outside in front of the house, Johnny paused. It was a chilly May evening. He was glad he had had his suede jacket on. He glanced up and down the street. Lights were on in most of the houses, but the professor's house was a dark mass of shadow. He was probably out at the movies or visiting one of his friends. Johnny felt alone and frightened. He listened to the wind that was rustling the new May leaves on the trees. Suddenly, he had had a great urge to rush across the street into the professor's house and turn on the living room lights and sit there until the professor came home. Johnny could do this if he wanted to. The professor had given him a door key. It was on the key ring in the pocket of his jacket. Johnny pondered. Then he felt a sharp twinge of pain in his ring finger, and that made his mind for him. And that made up his mind for him. The professor couldn't help him with the ring. He had to find Mr. Beard. Johnny clenched his teeth. He turned suddenly to the right, like a soldier making a turn on a drill field. Swinging his arms, he began to march down Fillmore Street. The sound of Johnny's footsteps grew fainter and then died away. He had disappeared into the darkness at the end of the street. Now, out of the shadows that shrouded the professor's house, a figure stepped. It was Professor Childermass himself. He was wearing his ratty tweed coat and a wide-brimmed felt fedora. On his feet were tennis shoes. With quick, springy, soundless steps, he began to move down the sidewalk, and soon he too had disappeared. When Johnny got to the church, he was once again disappointed. There was nobody there but Mrs. McGinnis. Mrs. McGinnis was a tall, big-boned, and rather silly old lady who wore floppy, wide-brimmed hats and held her head to one side as if she lived in an attic room with a sloping ceiling. She was kneeling in the front pew and thumbing her rosemary beads. Johnny was more than disappointed. He felt almost desperate. What had happened to Mr. Beard? Why didn't he come here anymore? But as Johnny was turning away to go, something caught his eye. Something small and white lying on the seat of the last pew. It was a piece of notepaper with writing on it. Probably it was somebody's grocery list. Why was he wasting time gaping at it? But it was oddly fascinating all the same. Johnny bent over and picked the note up. He saw Spindley's scrawly handwriting. The note said, "Meet me in Dustin Park. Yours very truly, Robert Beard." Johnny was startled and a bit amused. What an odd duck Mr. Beard was. Why had he left the note here in the back pew in the darkness? How could he be so sure that Johnny would find it? Nevertheless, he had found it, and he knew where Dustin Park was. It was over on the other side of the river, about a 15-minute walk from the church. Should he go? Mm. Johnny felt that he had to. He set his mouth in a determined frown. Abruptly, he turned and walked out of the church. The swinging doors the swinging doors creaked and quacked behind him as he went. Dustin Park was over in Cranbrook. Dustin Park was over in Cranbrook, which was the snooty part of Dustin Heights. The park was a little grassy triangle with a rail fence around it. It was surrounded by houses and one tall white colonial church. Inside the park were benches and a few young maple trees. And in the center of the park was a bronze statue of Hannah Dustin. She stood there, tense and defiant, on her high granite pedestal. In one hand, she held a tomahawk, and in the other, 10 Indian scalps. Hannah was a famous woman. She had scalped 10 Indians long ago on an island in the Merrimack River to get even with them for having murdered her baby right before her eyes. On the base of the statue was a list of the people who had paid for the statue and an inscription in Latin. But her name was not on the statue, and unless you knew the story of Hannah Dustin, you might have wondered who the lady with the hatchet was and what she had done. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I like that paragraph. When Johnny got to the park, it was deserted. There was an old-fashioned street lamp in the middle of the park and a bench under it, but there was no one sitting on the bench. Once again, Johnny's heart sank. He had walked as fast as he could. Now what was he going to do? With a dejected sigh, he slumped on into the park and sat down on the bench by the lamp. He glanced at his watch. It was getting on toward 9. He didn't dare stay too long. Grandma would be worried about him. He decided that he would wait for exactly 10 minutes and then give up and leave. Minutes passed. Johnny hummed to himself and looked aimlessly this way and that. He looked at the greenish bronze statue that held a tomahawk poised over his head. He peered across the street at the Unitarian church with its 6 white Corinthian pillars and its tall, graceful colonial spire. Now, as he watched, he saw somebody step out of the darkness next to the church. The figure moved forward quickly into the light. It was Mr. Beard. Ah, pausing briefly at the curb, he started to cross the street. Mr. Beard was wearing his black coat and a kind of black hat called a Homburg. When he saw Johnny, he glanced impatiently at him. Mr. Beard did not seem to be in a good mood. "Well," he said snappishly as he sat down on the bench, "you certainly took your time about getting here." He glanced at Johnny, and his large black eyes seemed mean and hard. Johnny was utterly confused by this remark. What was Mr. Beard talking about? He sounded as if he and Johnny had made a date to meet at some certain time. Johnny felt hurt, and there was also something in Mr. Beard's manner that frightened him. He wanted to get up and leave. But Mr. Beard's great dark eyes fascinated him. He stayed where he was. Mr. Beard smiled, but it was a crooked, lopsided smile. "And what is on your mind, pray tell?" Johnny held out his hand. The ring," he stammered. It's magical," said Mr. Beard in a cold, mocking voice. "Magical? Of course it is. Does that bother you, eh? Eh?" Johnny was stunned. So Mr. Beard had known all along that the ring was magic. A vague, shapeless fear began to form in Johnny's mind. What else did Mr. Beard know? And why on earth did he give him this ring? Mr. Beard took off his hat and laid it on the bench. His well-combed grayish white hair seemed to glimmer and sparkle in the lamplight. It made Johnny think of snow. And now Johnny noticed something else. Although he looked neat and well cared for, there was a faintly musty odor about Mr. Beard, as if perhaps his overcoat had been kept at a damp, dark closet too long. Again, Johnny had an overwhelming urge to jump up and run for home, but Mr. Beard's enormous eyes held him riveted to his seat. So the ring bothers you? Well, that's too bad, crooned Mr. Beard. His smile was cold and pitiless. Yes, that is very, very sad. Perhaps this will help. Mr. Beard raised his left hand, and suddenly Johnny felt as if his whole left arm was on fire. Pain shot up toward his shoulder, and the ring pinched horribly, far more painfully than Eddie's scissors had pinched. It felt as if red-hot pincers were squeezing his finger to the bone. Johnny's breath was taken away by the suddenness of this attack. He wreathed to and fro and gasped, "Stop! Stop! Please stop!" Mr. Beard lowered his hand, and the pain stopped. "There now," he said, grinning evilly. "Isn't that better?" "Of course it is. But I'm afraid you can't take the ring off. That is not a part of my little plan. This should teach you to be careful about accepting gifts from strangers. You can never tell what the gift might turn out to be. But you accepted my ring, my little friend, and you will have to accept the consequences." Mr. Beard chuckled. It was a low, weird chuckle that raised the hairs on the back of Johnny's neck. Johnny's face was pale and haggard. Sweat was streaming down his cheeks and stood in beads on his forehead. He felt like some small, frightened animal caught in a trap. Mr. Beard went on grinning. It was a goblinish grin, a grin that seemed to change the features of his face. "Haven't you guessed yet who I am?" he asked suddenly. "Haven't you guessed?" Mr. Beard's voice sounded strange and waverly so. It was like the sound you get when a radio is not tuned and quite right. "Haven't you guessed? Haven't you guessed?" The question seemed to echo endlessly in Johnny's brain, and now the air around him was shimmering, waving like water. And Mr. Beard's face changed slowly, to the face of an old man with an overhanging forehead, a jutted chin, a hawkish nose, and deep-set, burning eyes. Instead of an overcoat, he wore a heavy black woolen. Instead of an overcoat, he wore a heavy black woolen cape, and around his neck was a stiff white collar, the collar of a Catholic priest. Johnny stared. He felt as if his eyes were going to pop out of their sockets. His forehead throbbed, and he was afraid that he might faint. Meanwhile, across the street, a shadowy figure was watching. It was the professor. He was crouched behind a large evergreen bush in somebody's front yard. What he saw was Johnny sitting on a bench that was bathed in pale light of the street lamp. Johnny was staring hard at something, but the professor could not figure out what something was. Johnny was staring hard at something, but the professor could not figure out what that something was. As far as he could tell, the bench, except for Johnny, was empty and bare. Here we go. That was chapter 8. Poor Johnny got all caught up in a bigger mystery. He did get caught in a trap. Oh wow, that's poor Johnny. What's gonna happen now? But at least the professor's there and he knows what's up. He doesn't know anything actually, but he's there and he saw Johnny and he sees how scared he is and he knows that he kind of lied a little bit about only going to the church. So something's up and at least the professor's there. So Johnny is not alone. And yeah, we'll have to find out tomorrow in chapter 9. I hope you enjoyed today. This was really fun. Yeah, like and subscribe if you like, and I will see you next time. Thanks for coming. I appreciate you. Bye.